knows, that's Ian, or you may know, that's Ian Glass from Ducks Unlimited Canada, who is the ongoing technical support for this webinar series. My name is John Pattison Williams, and I'm the coordinator of the PHAV Policy Committee. And it's nice to see many familiar names on this Zoom call, and thank you to those that are able to attend today. As you know, we try through the PHAV Policy Committee to address different important themes that might be of interest to the stakeholder groups within this network. And we're moving on right now for this fall, for the next 3, to hear some more details about a research project at the University of Saskatchewan called Prairie Water. Seems quite fitting for this group. And so it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Colin Whitfield, the principal investigator, and Dr. Graham Strickert, a co-investigator on this project. And our hope is that we're looking forward to hearing from them about sort of the advancements and the work that they've been doing throughout, I believe it's been 5 years approximately in this project so far, and kind of what their findings are and its application to this broad PHAV network. So thank you very much. And Colin and Graham, I'll turn it over to you. And yeah, thanks again.
All right, thanks so much, John. Make sure that everybody can see this okay as we get started. Okay, so yeah, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Colin Whitfield. I will just leave my camera on so you can put a face to the name before I turn it off. And I'm really pleased to be able to be here to give this presentation today, along with my colleague Graham Strickert. So before I get too far, I just want to acknowledge that I am joining today from Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. And so I pay my respects to the ancestors of these lands and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And I also acknowledge that, given the focus of our project, that we are not limited just to Treaty 6 territory in our work, but we have spanned the treaties across the Prairie provinces in our work. So just to give an overview, there's the title for the talk today. As John mentioned, this is the first in a series of 3 talks that will be provided by our team. And what we wanted to do today is try to give a broad overview of the many different elements of our research to date. And we're going to try to build this into a more interactive format in the meetings to come in October and November, to try to showcase the tools that are emerging from our research efforts and have discussions about the decisions and how we can support maybe some of the decision making that you and your organizations are tasked with through the science that we're generating. So I'm going to give an introduction to the project. I'm going to talk about 2 of our thematic areas: water availability and water and ecosystem health. And then I'm going to turn to my colleague Graham, who will take us through the home stretch to talk more on the water practices and governance side, the water management practices and governance side of our research. Okay, so first off, how did we come to be? Well, we are a project that's funded by Global Water Futures, which was a large initiative started about 5 years ago now. I always lose track of time, especially in the last couple of years. And I don't really need to speak to those of you that are joining today about the importance of water on the prairies, but I will acknowledge that it is one of the most water insecure parts of the country. And so there are many challenges with respect to how we manage the water and how we understand these water resources. And so our research seeks to address that, and also to hopefully allow us to understand how we might adapt to the changing landscape, particularly with respect to changes in land management, changes in climate change that will affect water resources in the region. It's a climate of a landscape of extremes, particularly with respect to climate, and so adaptation has always been there in the culture. But we also have emerging issues with respect to potential flooding and wetland drainage and eutrophication and sustainable use of our groundwater resources. And so I'm going to try to highlight a few of the pieces of research we've been doing in these areas. And what we hope to do is be able to help contribute to building resilient communities by ensuring sustainable water management and governance. And so really what we want to do is to understand how our actions of today might affect our water resources in the future, and how we might better govern these actions and these systems as a whole. So as I touched on, we're organized into 3 broad thematic areas. We have a team focused on issues of water availability, both below surface and above surface. We have a team looking at issues of aquatic ecosystem health, and we also have a team looking at water management practices and governance. And so we're going to try to cover all of those today at 10,000 feet, perhaps, to highlight some of the things that we've done thus far. And hopefully, with the time that we have left after Graham and I present, we can pose a question to you folks and also take any questions, because we really want to have those conversations and understand how you might use this work, or how we might be able to help you in our ability to help you in our communication of the science and make valuable tools that will be used. This is the home stretch for us. We're in the final couple of years of the project now, and so this is a key phase for us to make sure that the science that we've generated is not just parked on a shelf somewhere, but actually reaches those who might use it. And so this is one effort at doing that. So it's a large project, and I just want to acknowledge before we get too far. So I'm one of the co-PIs along with Chris Spence. We have a team of leads for the different thematic areas, and we have about 17 co-investigators, most of them based in Saskatoon, but a few in other places, largely at the U of S, but also some from Environment Canada and other places. And the project has been really informed by our partners. We have something on the order of 30 or 40 different partner organizations, many of whom have come to our meetings in the past. Perhaps next year when we meet in person again, some of you might be able to join us as well. And so the value in the project has been that we've been trying to address questions that our partners initially raised. It was a user-led project, so they came to us with concerns and things they wanted to know more about, and we tried to craft a project that would address many of those questions. Okay, so I'm going to transition into a few highlights from our water availability team. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that understanding issues of water resources in the prairies is complicated by the fact that we don't have well-developed stream networks. So what this image is showing here is all of the stippled orange or yellow area is non-effective area. So that's meaning it's not contributing flow on an annual basis. It might contribute flow in really wet years, but not as a typical condition. And so this really challenges us as scientists in our efforts to try to understand what's happening across the prairie as a whole. And one of the things we wanted to do in our work was not just to focus on some of the intensive research basins that have been studied in the region, which, while valuable, present challenge for generalizing those results to the broader landscape. And so the results I'm going to show today are an effort at trying to come up with solutions that apply to the prairie ecozone as a whole, to make informed decisions about how we manage these water resources. So I'll start the furthest away from us, and we'll end more with the human dimensions that Graham will speak about. So one of our colleagues is working on issues of deep groundwater. And one of the things they've done is analyze the inputs as well as the recovery from wells in different geologic formations across the region. So primarily looking at oil and gas and trying to understand the water fluxes associated with these activities. And so what they have uncovered through this work is that the groundwater flows, the fluxes, will exceed background levels, and some have surpluses. So there's been more water injected into these wells than there has been fluids removed. And so there's a suggestion by this team that this will has the capacity to enhance hydraulic pressure and create upward flow, which is a concern because it could lead to leakage of fluids across these different reservoirs in the Williston Basin, but also through features such as leaky wells could present a pathway for these fluids to move vertically. We also have work on shallow groundwater, and Misaki Hayashi and his team have come up with a tool to simulate landscape average recharge. And so these images on the right show some of these results. And you can see that the recharge rates are relatively low. So we're in a region where we might get anywhere from 300 to 600 millimeters of precipitation, and only a small part of this is going to be potentially moving from above surface to below surface. And this occurs primarily through depression-focused recharge, even in places where irrigation occurs, even in relatively flat landscapes. His work suggests that it's really the depressions where this recharge occurs primarily. And his team has also looked at some pseudo-global warming to understand how this might change across the south of Alberta. We expect that there could be a decrease in the amount of recharge occurring under a future climate. And so this really suggests a strong constraint on the potential for long-term pumping from shallow aquifers as a water resource. And this work is currently being extended into Saskatchewan, so we hope that perhaps in a year's time or so, we might have an expanded map that shows these recharge rates across a larger area of the prairies. One of the other initiatives we took, and this really underpins a lot of the work we're doing, is that we wanted to be able to say, as I mentioned earlier, something about the region as a whole, rather than just a small collection of research basins. And so the way we've approached this is to come up with a watershed classification for the region. So what we did was we used a statistical approach where we incorporated close to 30 biophysical variables from things including topography and surficial geology and wetland characteristics, but also practices in terms of what's happening on the agricultural landscape. And this exercise resulted in 7 different watershed classes, and the names are shown there. So I'm going to focus on one of those today, but before I do that, I will show why we think this is a useful tool. The other thing I want to highlight, we've looked at concerns around climate change. We've also tried to address the impact of wetland drainage. This has been a question that we've received from many folks over the duration of this project. And so it's been a strong emphasis is to try to better understand the impacts of wetland drainage. One of the things we were asked to do was to develop a piece that summarizes the state of the science. And that was published this winter. And we tried to both identify the impacts, but also comment on the strength of the evidence and the strength of our knowledge about the potential impacts. So we covered issues from groundwater recharge, surface water flows, biodiversity, nutrient flows, and also got into things like the socioeconomics of wetland drainage and some of the perceptions around wetlands and why drainage occurs. So I'll touch on this a couple times today, but really the next few slides are going to focus on questions around wetland drainage, since this has been there's been such a strong motivation in this in our work. So we've used our watershed classification that I showed you a moment ago, those 7 classes, to try to understand the biophysical landscape and the response to different stressors. So what happens to the amount of runoff, for example, as the climate changes, or as we change the number of wetlands on the landscape. And so we come up with a virtual model. So we use the typical conditions in each of those classes. So we take the median conditions across a range of variables and use it to construct this virtual watershed that's representative of the class, broadly of the class. And then we use some information about climate to run a hydrological model to understand the hydrologic behavior. And when we do this, we see that we're able to do a reasonable job of capturing the hydrological patterns for these systems. And so this chart on the right here shows the 7 different classes, the results from our virtual basin modeling in red, compared to a small number of observations from hydrometric stations, Environment Canada hydrometric stations. And I show this for annual patterns. If we were to break it down into monthly, it looks quite similar. We're getting reasonable agreement at both scales, both annual and monthly. So let's take that a step further. So we're able to model kind of the typical or historical behavior of these systems, but what happens if wetland drainage occurs? And so you'll see in the image in the middle there, we've now removed a bunch of wetlands. The stream network changes its dimensions, its features. And so we want to be able to say something about what the response might be. So this is one of the things that came out of the synthesis statement before I show you those results. We said that the most important impact of wetland drainage on surface water storage and movement is an increase in discharge volume with declining storage capacity. So there's a pretty good degree of certainty that will increase annual discharge volumes. And there's high agreement about this, but maybe our evidence could be stronger. And part of the reason our evidence could be stronger is that these are difficult things to monitor, and we don't really have monitoring networks in place designed to capture this. And one of the challenges is that you need to run these monitoring networks for a long time and have a really good handle on how much the wetland coverage has changed to do this. So we think that our modeling approach is a really useful plank because it fills in some of these gaps that our monitoring data don't show particularly well. Okay, so here is a snapshot of what happens when we drain wetlands according to our hydrological modeling. So this graph shows on the horizontal axis different return periods. So from events that you might happen every year on the left, all the way up to 100 years on the right, and the volume associated with those events. And so the blue line is our baseline. So if we don't have any wetlands removed, this is representative of a more historical condition. And then the red and yellow lines represent a 50% loss in red and 100% wetland loss in yellow. And so we can see some really dramatic change as we remove wetlands from the landscape in terms of the hydrologic response. This occurs because we're decreasing the non-effective area. So we're increasing the amount of water, the amount of landscape that contributes flow in any given year. And this occurs even at relatively low levels of drainage, which I'll show another example of in a moment. And so as a consequence, as shown by the arrow here, the annual return periods end up being lower dramatically. So what that means is that in this example, something that would have been a return period happening about every 40 years, historically, if all of the wetlands are removed, you're going to see that amount of volume, annual volume, typically about every 3 years. So dramatic change in return periods associated with wetland drainage. Okay, I will transition to water and ecosystem health here. So this is team B, and show a couple of results there. The first one I'm going to talk about is nutrient export. And so this is coupled to what I just showed with respect to the virtual modeling. We expect that nutrient export will increase when wetlands are drained. There's going to be a lot of variability associated with physical structure, change to wetland complex function, nutrient management practices, a lot of variability. But what we've tried to do is come up with an estimate of how much change will occur by looking at our virtual basin modeling and then applying what we know about nutrient dynamics. And so I'll show you one example of that. So first, the hydrological behavior. On the x-axis, we have the percentage of wetland drains. So we do this in 10% increments from 0 to 100%. And two things are represented on this graph. The connected area fraction in black. So you can see as more wetlands are drained, we have a much higher proportion of the watershed that's connected and contributing flow. And as a consequence, we can see that the runoff amount shown in blue increases as we progressively drain more levels, higher levels of more wetland loss. So even at low levels of wetland loss, 10 and 20%, we're beginning to see change. You'll notice as well that there's a wide range on each of those bars, because in wet years, we don't see as much change, because in wet years, things are connected anyways in those extremely wet years. And in dry years, things don't connect because there's no water to move because